Joining us now, Shermichael Singleton. He's a Republican strategist, and Molly Jong-Fast, a special correspondent for Vanity Fair and host of the Fast Politics podcast. Shermichael, let me start with you. I mean, this has been kind of a MAGA-palooza all this week at CPAC. I mean, we were showing some images of Trump won hats and that sort of thing on tables. And you look at the recent polls, I mean, he's really out in front in almost every poll of the Republican field. I know it's very early, but he won the CPAC straw poll. Is there anything really standing in the way right now at this point of Donald Trump securing the Republican nomination, do you think?
I mean, I think one thing to be concerned about, Jim, and thanks for having me, is potential litigation against a former president. Look at Georgia. Could a potential indictment come? I think the jury is still out on that. I also think that Trump presents an interesting dichotomy for the Republican Party, which is why you're seeing Ron DeSantis move up in the polls with many Republican voters. And that is, if Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party, can he actually win, Jim? Many individuals that I've spoken with, donors alike, aren't necessarily sure of that. Can he pull over swing voters? Can he regain movement and positioning with suburbanites? That doesn't appear to be the case if you look at the last presidential. It doesn't appear to be the case if you look at the most recent midterm election. And that is a concern that many in the party, including donors, including other strategists, and even those working with some of the folks who are ardent Trump supporters are saying, you know, we want to win. And yes, we like Trump, but is he the best person to help us get across that finish line?
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect right now between the donor base and the MAGA base. Molly, you know, it seems Trump is positioning his presidential run as kind of a revenge tour. I think we have some sound from Trump's speech. I think this is one that's going to be making a lot of headlines. Let's listen.
In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. Today I add, I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. I am your retribution.
I am your retribution. He said it twice, Molly.
Yeah, I mean, look, this guy is out for blood. And I think the problem with all of these more normal calculuses about DeSantis is that Trump is not a normal candidate. So Trump will not do what Marco Rubio did or Ted Cruz did and go quietly. So I think that for a lot of these Republicans who think they can swap him out, I'm not sure how that works when you have someone who really is comfortable running as a third-party candidate or just destroying the party on his way out. I mean, remember, Trump is not a Republican per se. He's he's whatever that is. And so I don't think his heart is with the Republican Party, and I do not believe he will support whoever is the candidate.
And Shermichael, I mean, what do you make of the state of CPAC? I mean, is it the same conference that it used to be? I remember covering it, you know, 6 or 7 years ago, and it just strikes me as a very different organization now. Mike Pence, not there. Ron DeSantis, not there. It's a different CPAC now. I mean, Trump has a lot of people in that room right now, but some of these speeches earlier on in the conference had me thinking whether, you know, the CPAC should be held at the Holiday Inn in Crystal City.
Jim, it's definitely a different CPAC than it was when I used to go years and years ago. I mean, the sort of intellectualism that once upon a time defined the Republican Party because of individuals like Karl Rove, politically speaking, or intellectuals as far as the ideological meanings, if you will, of what it means to be a conservative, like National Review, Rich Lowry, those guys really aren't activists and participants in the modern day Republican Party. So there's this question, right, Jim, on what does it mean to be a conservative over the next 4 years? Who's going to be the individual or individuals to take that mantle and the charge of defining what conservative policies and positions will be as far as legislation goes? And I don't think the party has quite figured that out. The CPAC has had many CPAC versions, Florida, many other states across the country for 2 years now. And if you look at the crowd, it's a very low, it's a dim crowd. And I think that's indicative of the fact that many in the party are trying to figure out, where do we go after Trump? Do we stick with him, or is it time to move on? And as a strategist, and you're looking at the numbers, I would probably say, Jim, that it is time to move in a new direction, or the party risks a repeat of Trump versus Biden in 2024.
Right, 2018, 2020, 2022, not exactly a winning streak. Molly, one thing that we also noticed this week, Nikki Haley Trump's former U.S. ambassador to the UN. She had sort of a chilly reception at times. Mike Pompeo, you know, he was talking about the former president in sort of veiled references. Let's listen to that.
We've lost the popular vote in the last 7 out of 8 presidential elections. Our cause is right, but we have failed to win the confidence of a majority of Americans. That ends now.
Losing is bad because losing is bad, but the principles that we stand for are what's really at risk. And it's not a political problem. The problem is that the losses are a symptom of something much bigger. I think it's a crisis in conservatism. We've lost confidence that we are right. It's not just a crisis of competence, it's one of character as well.
I mean, Molly, this is almost what Shermichael was saying a few moments ago, in that, you know, the message for some of these candidates is that they want to move on from Trump, but they don't want to say his name in any of these speeches. It's almost like Beetlejuice. They don't want to say Beetlejuice too many times or something. But what is going on there with the fact that some of these candidates like Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo are just sort of tiptoeing around Trump?
I mean, I think they think that they could quietly lull away the base by sort of tricking them into not saying anything mean about Trump, but offering them sort of Trumpism light as a kind of, you know, possible bait and switch. And I think that ultimately this stems from this idea that they will not take the pain, right? They want the fringe. They want those votes because Trump won in 2016 by never alienating the fringe. And that fringe is really very fringy. I mean, that's the white nationalists and the autocrats and the really just the sort of dregs. And those were people where for such a long time, Republicans rejected those people. And, you know, Trump knows that's a good amount of people, and that's how he won. A good quantity of people, not good people. And so I do think ultimately, you know, they're trying to get those people without getting those people and without alienating them. And I think ultimately someone's just going to have to say, like, we don't embrace this kind of racism. And they're going to have to take the pain and then eventually rebuild the party.
Shermichael, what do you think about that? I mean, can you take on Trump without really confronting him by name or confronting him in general? I mean, what would you advise as a Republican strategist?
I mean, look, you have to. Now, you clearly would risk not being a competitive individual running for the Republican nominee, or nomination, I should say, but you have to. I mean, Pompeo is right when he argues or made the statement about conservatism. I think the problem, however, and I don't want to get philosophical here, but the party has really sort of become a nationalist populist party. And I think that there is room within the American populace, generally speaking, for conservatism in the traditional and classical sense. But I think that's far removed. I think when you look at many of the struggles that a more diverse country is presently dealing with and facing, what's the conservative answer, Jim, to many of those questions? What's the conservative answer to police reform? The conservative answer to education? The conservative answer to infrastructure or climate change? Those things no longer intellectually exist the way they once did in the past. And so I think that's the problem that the Republican Party is having in its inability to target and reach Americans beyond its base. And that is what's going to be necessary mathematically in order for the party to be competitive in federal elections.
And Molly, lastly to you, I mean, is Donald Trump Joe Biden's superpower?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, he's certainly Democrat superpower. I think you're going to have a hard time getting out of that primary without either Trump winning it or Trump destroying the person who does win it or Trump threatening to run as a third party. And I think, yes, I mean, Donald Trump continues to deliver for Democrats.